Hello, everyone. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. My name is Ellen Finnegan. I'm the founder of Teach to the Text, and I'm so glad to have you here today and to be able to introduce this talk by Claudio Salvucci as we open up the 250th year since the birth of our nation, the United States, and as we celebrate the feast day of Elizabeth Ann Seton. You're going to hear a wonderful talk today by Claudio Salvucci. He specializes in traditional American Catholicism and has authored numerous books, including The American Martyrology, The Roman Rite in the Algonquin and Iroquoian Missions, the Annals of Colonial North American series, and the American Language reprint series. His research on American liturgies and devotional traditions have appeared in the New Liturgical Movement, Liturgical Arts Journal, and Latin Mass magazine. And he currently serves as the communications director for the priestly fraternity of St. Peter in North America. But most importantly, he is the author of a charming book called The Menagerie of Marcipink that I have been teaching to students for over 10 years. He's a wonderful writer, and I'm so excited that he'll soon be teaching a class with Teach to the Text. He is creating a class called America, Course of Empire, Kingdom of Saints, and students young and old can learn about the history of their nation through the lives of the saints using primary source material from their lives. I'm so excited about the class because Mr. Salvucci teaches or works a full-time job. He will not be available to teach a live course, but we will have the whole course set up for you, and we are hoping that co-ops and Catholic schools will want to use this curriculum with a local on-site teacher who can help to really bring the curriculum alive for the students. So to that end, we are running a contest from now until March 31st called Imitate Your Favorite American Saint Contest. And you and your co-op and your group can register for the contest, compete in the contest, and possibly win free enrollment in his new course for up to 25 people. So it's a great opportunity, and as of December 29th, when I'm recording this, we don't have anyone signed up for it yet. So if you and your group sign up, you have a really good chance of winning. And so it's all going to be on social media, just posting pictures of basically dressing up like saints. So what you might do on Halloween, why reserve it for one day a year? So if you'd like to participate, there are links down below. Also, this is a little bit of a long talk. Mr. Salvucci is super passionate about his topic, and it's very, very interesting talk. I think you're going to learn a lot. There's a lot of us who are wondering what it means to be an American, how do we meld our Catholic identity with our American identity? This is really going to help you with that. Mr. Salvucci says, the calendar is one of the greatest ways that the church has given us to live out our patriotism and our love for our country. It's part of the fourth commandment. So the calendar itself, the liturgical calendar, can help us to do that. And I think this presentation is going to help you to start to see your Catholic identity and your American identity as more intermingled. And for my Protestant brothers and sisters, I hope that you stick around. Yes, there's going to be a lot of Catholic stuff in this talk, but you're going to learn so much about American history and some of the wonderful holy people that have helped to make our country great. So I really hope you enjoy the talk. For the kids, if you are gathering as a family to listen to this talk, which I think would be wonderful, if you want to download the bingo cards, you can play bingo. So there's a download, there's 30 different bingo cards, and you can set up the rules in your own house. Listen to the talk, put down a penny or a nickel or something every time you see the picture or see the word. See who can get as many bingos as they can, and maybe that person can decide what's for dinner tonight or something like that. So if it will make it a little more interesting to keep the kids involved, play some bingo as you sit down as a family and watch this. And I hope that this little talk will inspire you to make this your best Catholic year yet, and will inspire you to perhaps register or enroll in the course down the line so you can study with Mr. Salvucci as your teacher, or just build more Catholic devotion and devotion to the saints into your year this year. So God bless you all, and I will turn it over to Mr. Salvucci now.
Hello and welcome. January 4th, one of the first few days of the Semiquincentennial, when we're celebrating America's 250th birthday. And I want to thank Ms. Finnegan for allowing me to come on and to talk to you guys about the liturgical year. It's not a talk that you probably haven't heard before. You should know by this time about the liturgical year. It's the year we celebrate in the church, Christmas and Easter and all of that. And I think most of you probably know a lot about that already, and that's the kind of thing that you are expecting. But today we want to do something a little bit different. We're going to put a little bit of a different spin on it. We are going to talk about the liturgical year in the Catholic Church through an American lens. In other words, we're going to talk about how the year is shaped by us being in the United States of America, how the things we do in the United States of America, or at least could do, not all of these things are things we currently do, but the things we could do are maybe a little bit different than they do in the rest of the world, and some of the ideas that we can have and some of the things that we have from our own tradition. Our own American tradition. The church in this country has been around, longer than the Republic, actually. Longer than 1776. We can go back to St. Kateri and the North American martyrs in the 1600s. We can even go back to some of the martyrs in the very earliest martyrs we have in the 1500s. And we have a good almost 500 years, I think about 500 years of church history in this country. And it'd be good if we just kind of marinated in that for the 250th anniversary of the nation. So as you know, the church has its own liturgical year. It does not start on January 1st, but it starts on the first Sunday of Advent. So I'm going to, even though we're showing this talk on January 4th, I'm going to back up a little bit and go back a few weeks. And you guys just came through Advent, so you should kind of remember what it was like. We just experienced all that before. Now we're in the glorious season of Christmastide, and you wouldn't know it from my dark little cave in here, my little library. But yes, it is a very festive season, a very glorious and a bright season in Christmas. And of course, we welcome the Christ child into our hearts. But before we did that, we went back into Advent. In the very, very end of November or in the beginning of January, we were talking about preparing ourselves for the birth of Christ. We were talking about having a penitential spirit. Advent is a time when we prepare spiritually for the coming of Christmas and the coming of the Christ child. And we actually have a few little different things that we do in the United States that actually they're starting to spread throughout the world. But you know about the Advent wreath, of course. The Advent wreath is a real part of our Christmas tradition here in the United States. It actually comes from Germany, German Lutherans, to be specific. So when the German Lutheran Advent wreath came to America, and actually I think also when it was in Germany, there was a little bit of a hesitation about it because it was a Lutheran practice, and it was, of course, Catholics didn't want to be seen as, just abandoning their own traditions and wholesale adopting Protestant traditions, which really don't fit us as a church. But there was a little bit of a hesitation, but it seems to have been largely conquered, and people, I think, came to realize that, no, this is something that really works, even in the Catholic context. This idea of coming for Christ and waiting for Christ and lighting one candle a week as we await the Christ child. The thing that makes it distinctive in the United States, though, is that if you do a search online for the German name of the Advent wreath, which is Adventkranz, you will find that many of them are just solid red. The 4 candles are red, and then they're placed inside the wreath. That is what the German tradition was, and that is what came to America. Interestingly enough, it was in America that from all we can determine, 2 German immigrants, they came to America in the 1930s, a priest and a laywoman. They took this tradition and they decided to upgrade it a little bit and go from 4 red candles to 3 violet candles and 1 rose candle to symbolize more clearly the Sundays of Advent. So that part of the wreath tradition is actually an American innovation on a larger tradition, and that's the way in which it's now starting to become more popular throughout the world. I go to a very traditional church, and of course we do the Advent wreath every year, and it's almost unthinkable now to think of Advent without it. It's become so popular in Catholic circles. But that interesting little tidbit about the coloration of the wreath is very American. There's one other thing that we want to discuss about Advent too, in an American context. Advent used to be a more penitential season. Now, it wasn't completely penitential like Lent, but it did have its a much more of a penitential spirit. Before about 1917, in this country, at Fridays in Advent were actually a time of fasting as well as abstinence. So if you remember, before the 1960s, really, every Catholic was mandated to abstain from meat on Fridays. It's no longer mandatory. It is still recommended, by the way. Some people don't remember that, but it is still recommended that people do that. But you have the option now to substitute another penance if you would like. You didn't have that option before. You had to abstain from meat on Friday, but there was also greater fasting. Now, fasting is basically eating one meal a day, and we still do that on Ash Wednesday and on Good Friday. And there was a longer time. People did it for a longer period of time. They did it really throughout Lent back in the day. Through all of the days of Lent. So that would be, you start on Ash Wednesday, you go through Thursday, Friday, Saturday. You're fasting every single day until Sunday. Sundays you didn't fast, but that was all throughout Lent. So Lent was really austere for most of the countries in the world. And here in the United States, Advent was never that severe, as far as I can tell, but it was around the time that the Baltimore Catechism was being codified. There was a little bit of a penitential spirit in that people used to fast during the Fridays of Advent. So on Fridays in Advent, you would not only abstain from meat, but you would only eat one meal a day. And of course, that's not something that's required anymore. You don't have to do that. But if you're looking for something to do a little bit more penitential in your Advent season, if you want something to do that, there's a lot of things you could do, giving up chocolate or whatever, little things people do. But this is more of a traditional thing that people did. They fasted on the Fridays of Advent. Then, of course, Advent leads into Christmas, and we are in the Christmas tide season right now. There's a few interesting things to say about Christmas, and that is that in a few places in this country, it wasn't widespread, but at least in New England, which was controlled by the Puritans for really quite a long time. The Puritans were very strict Protestants as opposed to the other mainline denominations who had, liturgical days and who brought the liturgical calendar over from Catholics. Puritans did not celebrate Christmas at all. So, for instance, in Boston, Christmas was pretty much unheard of, I believe. I'm not a historian of New England, but Christmas was very much not tolerated in Boston up until the time when you started to get a great deal more of Catholic emigration from Ireland and the Irish that came to Boston. Of course, they were not going to let anybody stop them from celebrating Christmas. So then that started to come in. There was a time in the United States when Christmas, and you'll still find it, and you'll still find resistance to it. People are like, "Oh, Christmas is pagan" and all that. That's where that comes from. There's somewhat of a hesitation, but that didn't really last in America, and it's not really the case anymore, certainly not in any of the major cities. And what we have now is kind of a mishmash of celebrating of Christmas in America. And it comes a little bit from the Victorian revival of England that's brought in some practices. Those great, glorious hymns that we hear during Christmas, a lot of them were English hymns that have been translated, and some of them go back to Latin hymns and some of them aren't. But there's just that glorious tradition that really has swept the world. I love those Christmas hymns, and I know that even non-Catholics enjoy them a lot. And here in America, we've also had a number of other things come in that have helped shape our celebration of Christmas. We've had the German Christmas tree, of course, the another thing that German Catholics brought, and actually German Lutherans also, they started that tradition, I should say. And then German Catholics took it over from the German Lutherans, or didn't really take it over, but kind of also borrowed it. And so they were using that. And then in the Italian immigrants, of course, this was something that's dear to my heart, as my parents were Italian immigrants, the presepio, the nativity scene, which it was not restricted to Italy, but Italy was, the place, especially southern Italy, where it's really celebrated in really grand style. And if you go into, certain museums in the United States, you'll find that Neapolitan tradition of the creche, the nativity scene, the presepio, that it's like taken to a next level. So that's something that Italian immigrants helped promote here. And I remember growing up in Philadelphia in the 1970s and 80s, and we had this kind of, no matter which aunt I went to, and we had always, there was the Christmas tree. It was set up with all the lights and everything, and then under the Christmas tree was the presepio. So it was always the same kind of two things, and I kind of think of that tradition as kind of a melding of the American immigrant groups. And those were not the only two, of course. We celebrate St. Lucy's Day here, which is more in Advent, but it's part of the Christmas cycle. We celebrate here. That's Swedish, even though she was an Italian saint. There's Eastern European things that come in, and here we are in northeastern Pennsylvania, where they have a lot of Eastern immigrant traditions that have come in, Polish and Hungarian, and that's helped shape American Christmas too. The one last thing that I want to recall about Christmastide is that there is a species of evergreen bush, really, and it's called the wax myrtle or the bayberry in North America. And I think it's unique to North America. I don't think Europe has it. But it's called the wax myrtle because it produces these little bayberries that if you boil the bayberries, you can get this waxy substance off of it. And you can actually, the colonial Americans used to make candles out of this. If you boil enough of them, and it takes a lot of berries because they don't have a lot of wax on them. But if you boil a lot of berries, you can make these bayberry candles out of them, which is where we get the modern bayberry candles, not all of which are actually authentic bayberries. Some of them are chemically synthesized, but it's a great little tradition. So that's something that we have, and there's some traditions in New England about, we don't want to be superstitious about it, but it's if you burn the candle down, then you get good luck in the next year. And it's of course it's a little bit superstitious, but we also we know that in these folk traditions, sometimes it reminds me of the old European traditions of Catholic countries in Europe, like my ancestors in Italy. They have that kind of melded tradition of folklore and local flora and fauna, and the church's year. So there's always that kind of thing going on. So I like to think of bayberry as something that the church could probably use. And bayberry candles are kind of expensive, and they're kind of fancy, but that's something that we could use in the future, that if we wanted to bring that into our church traditions, that's something we could bring in. Okay, and now we're in Christmastide, and right before we leave the season of Christmastide, we have January 4th, which is today, the feast of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, who is one of our great saints, and an American citizen, and a wonderful saint, and this early in the year. And I think that it's just really appropriate for us to start out our celebration of the Semiquincentennial with Elizabeth Ann Seton. She is a wonderful example of a saint, and I think that it shows something that's important about it, that this early in the year, that this is the first really American saint we get in the calendar year from January to December. And it makes us think of St. Augustine's, the way he juxtaposed the Church of God versus the Church of the city of God versus the city of man. So the city of man is the city that we live in, and we, of course, love our country, and we respect our country, and we abide by the laws of our country. And really, we should, as part of the fourth commandment, we should be patriots. We should love America, and I certainly do. But we also have to recognize that we live in a fallen world as Catholics, and really as everybody, but Catholics recognize it, I think, that we're all under the regime of original sin, and that, this world isn't perfect. So America's never going to be perfect because it's on this side of the divide. It's on this side of heaven, not that side of heaven. So the only place that America is really going to be what she is meant to be is on that side of heaven. So it's important for us to recognize that there is sort of a parallel founding of America, that there is a parallel founding that's kind of, it's like the founding fathers and Jefferson and Madison and Washington and Franklin founding, and Adams, the founding documents of America and creating a nation out of these 13 colonies. But it's a little bit different because it concerns itself with the city of God. It doesn't concern itself with the city of man. It doesn't concern itself with, necessarily as a primary thing, the things that we are doing here in in life and in this fallen world. We're all trying to make money and live and have enough freedoms to do what we're supposed to do and get to heaven. But the parallel founding is that I like to think of the saints as the American founding fathers, that the real founding fathers, in a sense, and founding mothers, because they are the ones that are establishing the America of heaven. They are the ones that are really showing us how to be American in heaven. And I say that in a, half-joking way, but not an entirely joking way, because we take all of what we are with us to heaven, and everything that we are is purified, and it is brought to a higher level of existence. So that if we're male, we will be masculine, we will have a more perfect masculinity in heaven. If we're female, we have a more perfect femininity in heaven. We have a more perfect fatherhood. We have a more perfect childhood. We have a more everything in us is perfected in a certain way. And I think that includes our national origin and our national characteristics. Okay, there is a certain universality in Christianity, of course. There always is. You can't just separate countries from each other just because they're slightly different countries, and we realize that we're all one in Christ Jesus. But we're not forced to all be the same. That's something that Christianity has always recognized. And with regard to the liturgical year, I think it's really important to recognize that, because the liturgical year is really where the church's liturgy changes the most from place to place. The Mass doesn't necessarily change. Now, we do have different rites of Christianity, right? So we have the Byzantine rite, the Maronite rite, the Latin rite. So we do have that. That does happen. There's geographical changes. And even within the Latin rite, there is geographical changes. So you have, the Mozarabic rite, or the of Spain. You have the Ambrosian rite of Milan. You have these different rites of Christendom. That also happens too. And even they're quite different from the Roman rite. The Ambrosian rite, for instance, has 6 weeks in Advent, so it's quite different. The Mozarabic rite, totally different, like a different canon. It's it's a very, very different form of Mass. And then you have slight differences, like you may have, if you've ever heard of the Sarum rite. The Sarum rite was the rite of Salisbury in England. So that was slightly different. You have little tiny variations in various places throughout Christendom, in France and in Germany. You have different tiny variations. So that does vary. But the big variation is in the calendar. And it's so big that if you go back to the Middle Ages and somebody handed you a book of hours. A book of hours was a prayer book of the Middle Ages, was one of the most, actually the most popular probably book in the Middle Ages was a book of hours. It was a prayer book of Psalms and based on the divine office or the liturgy of the hours as we call it today. You didn't have to know anything about medieval writing and epigraphy and anything of all of that to know where a book of hours came from. All you had to do was open the calendar. And if you open the calendar and let's say St. Bavo was in there, you would know, okay, St. Bavo is in there. There was a cult of St. Bavo in the city of Ghent in Belgium. So you would say, okay, well, this comes from comes from Ghent, or a Belgian a writer did this, or at least he did it for a Belgian patron. That's how hyper specific it was. You were able to go to the calendar and tell pretty quickly where any of these liturgical years were actually held, because the calendar differed from place to place, and it just naturally does that, and it's always done that. It's always done that way back to the 1st century and the 2nd century, when Catholics used to keep lists of martyrs, and they would, of course, they remembered these people. If St. Peter and Paul died in Rome, the Romans remembered like when he would die, and they would commemorate him, and to them it was very fresh and it was very stuck in their mind. So, and not just Peter and Paul, who would be, of course, every Catholic, no matter where in the world, would have an interest in Peter and Paul, but like somebody like Saint Anastasia, who we celebrated during Christmas. She was a Roman martyr. So the Romans kind of remembered these martyrs more so than any other places. So there's, if you look through the Martyrology, which is a collection of saints and martyrs, you will find some very famous ones and some very not so famous ones, some that are very obscure. And these very obscure ones may have had a following in certain cities and certain areas, and they didn't really in other areas. So this is something where the church has always been. It's always varied. And her liturgy has always reflected this. And it's not only in which saints are commemorated on which days, but what the ranking is. So, for instance, you'll take a saint like let's take Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, since that's January 4th. If you go to a church in Rome, on January 4th, you probably will not get, I'm pretty sure you won't get, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton's feast. It'll be just a Mass of Christmastide. It'll just be a regular Mass. Because in Rome, they don't have a real good devotion to her. But we do in the United States. So it becomes a higher priority feast for us. And in certain places, like you can have a feast be of higher priority just because it's local. So, if you have like a certain saint, like Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, I'm sure their shrine in Emmitsburg, Maryland, they are going to celebrate her, no matter what. Like even if January 4th falls on a Sunday. Now, normally, if a feast falls on a Sunday, the Sunday takes precedence, and you celebrate the feast. Either you drop it, or sometimes you can move it. So that's what usually happens. The Sunday takes precedence over the local feast. That doesn't always happen, though. If your parish, for instance, if it is named St. Elizabeth Ann Seton Parish, well, guess what? You get to celebrate that no matter what. Not no matter what. You don't get to replace Easter and Christmas, but you get to. But if it's a regular Sunday Mass, yeah, you can just bump that. I remember several times I go to church, St. Michael's in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and, the Feast of St. Michael fell on a Sunday. And guess what? We got to bump the Sunday Mass and celebrate the Feast of St. Michael on the Sunday because we were dedicated to St. Michael's. And sometimes this happens over larger areas and particular cities and, particular congregation. If you're, a daughter of charity of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, then you might be able to celebrate her feast day as well as on a higher rank. So this great ranking of feasts, this great localizing of feasts, it really affects the liturgical calendar. And especially if you remember that in the old days too, these feasts would get an octave. It wouldn't just be one feast for one day. So it wouldn't just be like, say, January 4th and then, that's it. There would be a whole octave, which is 8 days of celebration. So you would get, for instance, you would get St. Elizabeth Ann Seton on the 4th and on the 5th, and not on the 6th, because what would happen on the 6th is Epiphany would take precedence over St. Elizabeth Ann Seton's feast. So you would kind of pause that, and then you would just continue, the 7th, the 8th, the 9th, all the way to, I don't know where the octave ends of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, but you would get basically 8 days of feasting out of that. And that was very typical. That was very typical of local saints even. It wasn't just, we think of the Christmas octave and the Easter octave. We've actually lost a lot of octaves that used to be there in the last 100 years or so. We used to have an All Saints octave, there was Pentecost octave we kind of know about, but we've lost a lot of it. There actually was an octave for local saints that affected the calendar. That's something that the church decides to bring back. That would be, I would particularly love it. But you don't really have to do exactly what the church does anyway, in terms of your private devotions. If you're doing private devotions and you have a particular devotion to St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, then, you could keep the octave, just like say some extra prayers to her, or, say the collect of her Mass, for instance, which is, the collect is like the main prayer of her during her Mass. So, you just say that for the 8 days, and you can keep it that way. So like the opposite of a novena, so a novena, you start early, you anticipate the feast, you start it early, and then you say everything, and then you get to her feast, and, you celebrate the feast. Well, the octave is like, instead of starting early, it's pushing it later, so it's just, we're still kind of in the spirit, and we're just kind of celebrating. So, if there are saints that are particularly, you're particularly devoted to in your family or even in your personal life, this is something that you can do. You can just kind of keep the octave, in your own homes and just, say some extra prayers or, keep it however you like, because it is a devotional thing that you don't have to depend on the church to set. It's something that you can just do on your own. There's one little thing that I kind of want to mention of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. It's always struck me that if you read her accounts and her biographer's accounts, when she and the sisters, the community that she founded, were first at Emmitsburg, Maryland, she has a little quote there. She said, "So earnest was every heart that carrot coffee, salt pork, and buttermilk seemed too good a living." I love this little quote because it shows kind of the colonial aspects of it, and of course this was in the 1820s. It was quite a bit after colonial period, but you might have caught a couple of those things in there. Salt pork, basically kind of like bacon, but carrot coffee, Claudio? Yes, this particularly struck me too, because this was something that people did in colonial times. Coffee was very hard to get. And remember, we're going to be talking about this later too, but remember, in colonial times, things were very hard to get. So, you couldn't get coffee all the time because coffee was grown very, very far away in South America or in Africa or whatever. And, it wasn't terribly reliable. It had to be literally shipped, sent by ship. And it just wasn't, the traffic wasn't good. And especially if you were in Emmitsburg, you would have to wait for somebody to bring it from a port city, and it was very difficult. So they made a kind of a coffee out of carrots. What they did was they take carrots, they cut them up into like bean-shaped or like little pieces. They would roast it in the oven, and then they would brew the coffee from that. And it sounds a little weird, and I've tried it. I've made it myself, and I don't know if I made it right, but I've tried it, and it's interesting. But I'm not a huge coffee drinker, so I don't know if it would go over with every single coffee drinker, but it shows you a little bit of their penitential spirit there at Emmitsburg, and it shows you also that they how they adapted to their conditions, and it is something of a little interesting Americana that I picked up on, and sometimes we don't do this every year, but I have experimented with it. I was like, oh, okay, well, I also read that they had coarse rye bread. That the sisters, that's what they ate in their first year at Emmitsburg. So, I thought to myself, well, let's have like a little. We'll commemorate Elizabeth Ann Seton's feast day we'll have a little interesting breakfast that day because it's Christmas tide. It feels kind of breakfasty. So I would make carrot coffee and salt pork, which was bacon, basically carrot coffee, bacon, and rye bread and toasted rye bread, and that was kind of our little Setonian breakfast. But this is something that, of course, the blogs and a lot of moms do this stuff. If you remember the mommy blog phase from the early 2000s and the 2010s, they were great at coming up with stuff like this. And, this feast day, we're going to have this particular dish. We're going to kind of remember it. And this is really important. I think it's a great way to kind of incarnate the church into our daily lives, because this is something that the Europeans did very well. They had the church in their midst for so long that they were able to take these practices and just have like special dish. Oh, this is what we have on this particular feast day. We have this particular dish. So it's something that I think that we should also do in America, and we should do it with our saints because those are our saints. So I think we should do it with all saints as well. We do that a lot of times. I know people that do, like for St. Joseph's Day in March, they will do like certain traditions that have come from Italy. And they'll do, we'll do this. That's great, but I would like us also to do this for our own saints, because these are our own saints, and if nobody else does them, then we should be doing them, because they're ours. We are closer to them than anybody else. So it's really important, I think, for us to be looking at ways that we can kind of take these feast days and make them live in our homes and not just in the church. So we go to the church and we hear the Mass of Elizabeth Ann Seton, but we don't, that's it. And then we come home and then the day's a regular day. No, we should either celebrate it if we can celebrate it, or, at least make it, some fun some other way. We do the liturgical part of it, and then we do the paraliturgical part, which is maybe in the kitchen or, some kind of party or a festival or something. And this is all in Christmastide, so I think it's in the right spirit. Okay, so the interesting thing is that the next day, which is January 5th, which when you're watching this will be tomorrow, is another American saint. So we have two back-to-back, January 4th and then January 5th. And January 5th, of course, I know, because I was born and raised in Philadelphia, was St. John Neumann. And St. John Neumann was the Bishop of Philadelphia in the 1800s, and he was canonized around the same time as Seton, actually. And so his feast day is January 5th. It would have been on the traditional vigil of the Epiphany when he was canonized, but just a few years before he was canonized in 63, I believe. Just a few years before that, the Vigil of Epiphany was suppressed on January 5th. So, of course, Epiphany happens on January 6th. The Vigil would have been January 5th, and that would have been a day of fasting and abstinence, just like the day we were talking about previously, of the Fridays in Advent. But it had already been, the church had already gotten rid of it, I think, in 1955. So it got rid of a lot of octaves and vigils and stuff. So the January 5th became like a blank day that day, and so it was sort of, it opened the way for St. John Neumann to come in and have his feast on that day. So we don't, because the vigil got dropped. Now, I'm not sure what would have the rules been. Would he have been allowed to have a feast on that day? I don't think so. I think the vigil would have taken precedence. But, if he was the patron of something, would it have been allowed to? I don't know. But in any case, we don't have the official the vigil of Epiphany anymore. What I kind of do is I like to recognize both. So because I am from Philadelphia, so Saint John Neumann is an important saint to me. So when it comes to that day, I like to say both the prayers of the vigil that we got rid of, and the prayer to Saint John Neumann, as sort of both to commemorate them both on that day, just to remember it by. The other one other interesting thing about Saint John Neumann is that he is the patron of the Philadelphia Mummers. And if you don't know what the Philadelphia Mummers are, it's a parade that we do every year on January 1st. It's the oldest folk parade in the United States. It goes back to, officially in 1900, but it's actually quite a bit older than that. He's the patron of that parade. So it's kind of it's another Christmas celebration that we do in Philadelphia, and it's kind of wrapped up in that. And he's the patron of it. I think he was made patron in 1991. So again, that's Philadelphia is an old city, and I think that there's a little bit of a European way to liturgize our year, and that I like, because it's not just celebrating him in the church, but it's also celebrating him. Oh, this is a great Christmas festivity that we do during Christmas time. The next great feast day of an American saint that we have is later in January. It's Saint Mary Ann Cope. Her feast day is January 23rd. St. Mary Ann Cope was born in Germany in 1838. She only lived there, I think, about a year, and then her parents brought her to America and into upstate New York, and she ended up dying in Hawaii in 1918. She worked with St. Damien of Molokai. So she is a very Hawaiian saint, but she also has ties to upstate New York. So she lived there much of her life, Utica, Syracuse. So she's got important ties there, and of course in Hawaii, where she worked with the leper colony, I assume, and other places. If you're looking in the middle of winter there in late January to have an excuse for a Hawaiian luau or some kind of Hawaiian festival, that's a great time to do it. And just to inject a little bit of tropical, pineapples and coconuts into your foods, and a little bit of fun and your parties that day, because that's a perfect way to remember St. Mary Ann Cope. The next thing I want to talk about is Septuagesima. Now, this is an interesting little liturgical season. And yes, it is a season. It's really 3 Sundays. It's called pre-Lent. And if you go to a Latin Mass, or if you go to the Ordinariate Mass, the Anglican Use Mass, they also have these, I believe, which is 3 Sundays before Lent. So, you have Ash Wednesday and then the first Sunday of Lent, right? So in the modern calendar, you have the time after Epiphany that goes all the way from Epiphany to Lent. But in the old calendar, in 1962, there was a little bit of a change there. You had time after Epiphany, and then at a certain point, called Septuagesima Sunday, you would stop. You would stop the Epiphany readings, and you would start the Septuagesima readings and everything. And you had 3 Sundays of pre-Lent. It was just to start getting you into the idea of Lent without doing, necessarily the big penances. So there was not a real penitential time, but it started to be sort of penitential. And the big thing that was done before Septuagesima Sunday was the burial of the Alleluia. The Alleluia just disappeared out of the liturgy at Septuagesima Sunday. You didn't hear it anymore. It just wasn't said anymore. And we still do this during Lent, but in the old calendar, it was also done from Septuagesima Sunday on. So you didn't hear the Alleluia all the way up until finally the Easter Vigil. So that was a long time. So you had basically 6 Sundays of Lent, including Passiontide, and then you had you had 4 Sundays plus Passion Tide. It was another 2 Sundays. And then you had 3 Sundays before that. So you went a long time. It was a very austere time liturgically. You didn't hear the Alleluia. And interestingly enough, Septuagesima was one of the things that didn't get lost in the transition when the church in England became the Anglican Church. That was not lost, and that's why the Ordinariate still has it. If you go to some early American almanacs that were not Catholic, by the way, if you go to early American almanacs from like the 1800s or I think even the 1700s, oftentimes you'll find Septuagesima, Sexagesima, and Quinquagesima Sunday in there. This was something that was just kept. So I think it's part of our American tradition. I'm not a big fan of having lost those 3 Sundays, but I think we can still keep them in our own way. And certainly, if you want, you can go to a Latin Mass on those Sundays and see what how the church used to keep them. Or you can go to an ordinariate parish where they're also kept to some degree. And here's an interesting thing. Septuagesima is the season kind of Mardi Gras. There's the very tail end of Septuagesima right before Ash Wednesday. So you have Ash Wednesday, you have Quinquagesima Sunday, which is the last Sunday of the season of Septuagesima. Quinquagesima Sunday, and then you have Monday, Tuesday, and then Ash Wednesday. So you got 3 days. You have that Sunday, and then you have Monday, Tuesday, and then bang, Ash Wednesday when Lent really begins, and the fasting and all that. That Monday and Tuesday, was known as a time called Shrovetide. And Shrovetide, to be shriven, meant to be confessed, basically. It was a way of like removing your sins, okay? So people would go to the confession that day, and they would also have a little bit of fun before Lent. And the church was always, allowed it, but of course, the church didn't want it to get out of hand. And so a lot of times, the Mardi Gras festivities, sometimes they'd be like, hey, whoa, that goes too far. Like, with anything else, sometimes that the church allowed certain things to happen, but that we tend to ruin them by going overboard and taking them a little too far. And the church has got to be like, hey, it's okay to blow off a little steam, to have like, for instance, Monday was called Pancake Monday, because, people would eat up the eggs during Lent. Used to be that eggs were forbidden during Lent. So they would make pancakes and try to use up all of the eggs. That's still a great thing to happen. But, if you look at the traditional Mardi Gras colors, and I just recently discovered this myself, that the traditional Mardi Gras colors are gold, green, and purple, right? These are actually the 3 colors, the 3 liturgical colors that lead us from the Epiphany to Ash Wednesday. So the gold, the kind of the 3 kings colors. The gold is the gold of Epiphany. Gold is a great color to symbolize kingship, and it's also a liturgical substitute for white. So any white season, you can use gold vestments. You can also use it for other seasons too, but it's very commonly used on white. So you have white, and then you have green, which is the time of post-Epiphany. So we have green time, that sometimes we call it ordinary time in the new liturgy. So that's that whole period between after Epiphany, but we haven't quite yet gotten to the Septuagesima and Lent. And then purple is Septuagesima, where the priests are wearing violet vestments again. And then Lent, which is, of course, violet again. So it's interesting to me that the kind of the New Orleans Mardi Gras tradition still has that those colors that are associated with the liturgical period from Epiphany to Lent. And of course it would be, right? Because Louisiana was such a Catholic colony. So that's a little interesting thing there. Without getting into Lent quite yet, we just got to mention Valentine's Day. And this, to me, Valentine's Day is very frustrating to me because it's an odd feast. If you go to an old church that celebrates the Latin Mass, you will in fact have St. Valentine's Day on February 14th. the church will have a mass for Saint Valentine, and that's still there. It's still there. It's still part of the calendar. If you go to a gas station or a supermarket or a department store, you're also going to find that they remember that St. Valentine's Day is on February 14th. They seem to remember it, and it's been like that in the Christian calendar for millennia, for hundreds of years. St. Valentine was a Roman martyr. But for some reason, they changed the calendar and they got rid of St. Valentine and put Cyril and Methodius on February 14th. And nothing against Cyril and Methodius. I'm a big fan of Cyril and Methodius, but I'm not sure why they had to get rid of St. Valentine's Day to make room for them. And it's kind of weird because you have the old church and the Latin Mass church still celebrating St. Valentine's on that day. And you have the secular culture still celebrating Valentine's Day on that day. But most Catholics in the United States who are going to a regular, Novus Ordo parish don't get it. And to me, it's a little bit frustrating because there's that disconnect there. Like we're disconnected from our heritage, and it would be better for me if everybody celebrated St. Valentine's Day, and then we could complain about the secularists together, maybe corrupting the holiday into something that it's not. But but it's also not a bad thing for us to focus on. Certain aspects of St. Valentine's, the sort of the golden legends surrounding St. Valentine and why he was picked to be kind of the patron saint of lovers and everything, and so it's a good thing for us to be liturgically reflective of too. Now we get out of February and we come to one of my favorite saints, St. Catherine Drexel, on March 3rd. She was born in Philadelphia, another Philadelphia saint, 1858. She died just one county over in Bensalem, Pennsylvania, 1955. And of course, St. Catherine Drexel, if you know her story, she was born into Philadelphia high society. She was a daughter of the Drexel family. The Drexel family was very, very wealthy bankers. I mean, her dad took her out west in a private rail car that was provided to him by the president of the railroad, and that's how they ended up exploring the West. She was extremely wealthy. Her family was extremely, extremely wealthy, but she gave it all up. She gave it all up to enter the convent, and it was a big deal at the time in the 1800s when she did that. She gave up society to join the convent and to start the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. And she, as a result of actually her Western trip, she had a particular love for the Black and Native American populations of the United States. She saw how in the late 1800s especially, they were struggling. Blacks were still, still getting their feet after Reconstruction, and there was, that was a really bad time in race relations after the Civil War, when there were a lot of lynchings going on and all that, and Native Americans on the reservation system were not doing very well either. A lot of them were in poverty, especially out west, and she took it upon herself to use her fortune after her father died to help them. And she really spent her last dime, and she didn't use much money for herself. She was not, typical, you think of a bad nonprofit organization now that fundraises but their presidents and their board of directors or whatever are living high off the hog, and you think of that and you're like, oh, I'm not going to give money to these people. St. Catherine Drexel was definitely not that. You could go and see her shrine, and they have like the little stubby pencils that she used to use because she was absolutely scrupulous about using her money for the poor and not for herself. And she wore her pencils down to a little nub, just to get the most money out, so she could use it on the poor of the United States. So she helped found institutions like Xavier University in Louisiana, which is the only Catholic historically black college in the United States. So did just tremendous things, and she's celebrated on March 3rd. Usually that falls during Lent, so it's typically like saints, I mentioned about octaves before. Octaves weren't celebrated during Lent, no matter what. So if your saint fell during Lent, like even a great saint like Saint Joseph or the Annunciation, that didn't get an octave during Lent, because Lent is a penitential season. It's a very penitential, the most penitential season. So we might have like a big feast like the Annunciation or Saint Joseph or something, but it'll just be kept for a day, and then we'll go right back to Lent again. So St. Catherine Drexel, that's what would have happened. But there are other ways you can celebrate saints, and typically, you would find like a translation of a saint, like if they moved the saint's bones, which they actually did a few years ago. St. Catherine Drexel, they moved her bones and her remains from her mother house in Ben Salem to the cathedral in Philadelphia. So there's other ways you can keep saints' holidays outside of Lent. So that's one thing to keep in mind as well, that these saints often don't just give you one day to celebrate them. You can celebrate them over several days throughout the year. I don't want to say too much about Lent because that's usually the same everywhere, but I do want to mention something about Palm Sunday. And I mentioned this before, that it was hard to get stuff from, like coffee, from very far away to your particular area. That was true of Palms, too, for Palm Sunday. So, interestingly enough, the church had a very lax attitude towards what you used for palms in your churches on Palm Sunday, simply because for 2,000 years, you couldn't rely on getting shipments of palms from the Middle East or from some tropical area and, we'll just, get a shipment in of palms and we'll just use those. No, you couldn't do that. You had to use what was around. And if you lived in a northern climate, you had to use what was around, and there were no palms. And moreover, since this is a lot of times in spring, there's not really, and especially if it's early spring, there's not really anything leafed out yet. So you might have had to use an evergreen tree, whatever was around, or in the case of Ukraine, very cold country, Ukraine, but they would use pussy willows because they were the very first things to come out. So they were symbols of the resurrection. So the Byzantine Rite had this, they even call it Pussy Willow Sunday, because that's when the Pussy Willows came out, and they made it a part of their Palm Sunday tradition, which is a great way to handle it. It was a very unculturated thing. It was, they couldn't get palms, so they used what they had. And the church is pretty lax about what you can use, by the way, or at least it was. I'm not sure if it is anymore, but so in England, for example, they would use yew branches, Y-E-W. And in fact, they actually called the yew palm. So that it kind of worked itself into the vernacular of England, where you would often call the yew a palm. Because that's what was around. They couldn't get palms. In colonial America, same thing. So what did the Indians use? Because we had Catholic Indians. They were converted to the faith by missionaries. So what did they end up using? Well, in the eastern part of the United States, they would typically use arbor vitae, or also known as white cedar. And there's an interesting, arbor vitae means, of course, in Latin, it means the tree of life. So we're talking about Palm Sunday. Now we're using a species of white cedar called the arbor vitae. And it makes us think of the tree of life. It makes us think of the cross, right? And there's an interesting story that when, it's not a story, it really happened, but when Jacques Cartier came to North America, his men were dying of scurvy, and scurvy is a disease that really hit sailors very hard because it's a vitamin C deficiency, and they couldn't, they were eating like salt pork and preserved foods on board ship. They could not get fresh fruit. So it was very hard for them to get enough vitamin C. And scurvy is basically a lack of vitamin C. So, they came in and the Indians saw that they were really suffering. And the Indians said, oh, okay, wait, we'll take care of you. So they took some branches of the arbor vitae and they boiled them up and they said, drink this. So, and the Jacques Cartier's men drank it. This was like in the 1540s. So it was very, very early. So they drank it and boom, like within a day they were back to normal again. They had replenished their stores of vitamin C. So that's where it got its name. That's where this particular North American tree got its name as Arbor Vitae, the tree of life, because it saved Jacques Cartier's men. So, of course, that's great. There's a lot of great symbolism there for Lent, right? Just fantastic symbolism for Lent and for the cross that we're going towards, Holy Saturday and Good Friday and Holy Saturday and Easter. So, and of course, palms. We do have palms in the United States. Oh, I meant to say also, the Western U.S. used a slightly different species, or Western red cedar. That was Western red cedar, and I think it was the Flatheads tribe that used that. So depending on where you were in the United States, you could use something in the cedar family, or in the South, you had palms. We actually have palms, and then there's one particular palm called the sabal palmetto. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but it's also called the cabbage palmetto or the Carolina palmetto. And it's not quite the palm that they have in the East, in Jerusalem and all that. So it's not exactly, but that is basically the majority of palms that we use today in the United States are this species, the sabal palmetto. And so we get them from, I think, Florida and Georgia, I think, the Carolinas maybe. So this is a particularly American palm tree that we use. So that even though we're getting them from far away, we're not getting them from the Middle East. We're getting them locally from America and Florida, and that area can be proud that they're providing that not only to America, but I understand for the world. So America really has influenced that. I'm going to skip ahead to May 10th, which is St. Damien of Molokai. We already mentioned St. Mary Ann Cope in Hawaii. St. Damien of Molokai is the big Hawaiian saint. He was born in Belgium in 1840, and he died in Hawaii 1889. He worked among the lepers in Molokai, the leper colony there, and he actually contracted and died of leprosy. Again, his feast day is May 10th. This is interesting to me that this feast is optional in the United States. So, like here in Pennsylvania, where I am, you don't have to celebrate it. You know, if you go to Mass, the priest may decide to celebrate his feast or not, depending on, his particular interests or not. It is an optional memorial in the United States, except in Hawaii. In Hawaii, it is not an optional memorial. Every Hawaiian priest has to celebrate the feast of St. Damien of Molokai on May 10th. Why? Because he's their saint. And, the Diocese of Hawaii is just like, of Honolulu is like, that this is our saint. We have to do this. We don't have a choice about this. And this is how things vary, again, from place to place. You can have something in Hawaii that the Hawaiians decide, oh, well, he's our saint, so we really have to celebrate him. And then the rest of the country can be like, yeah, he's great, he's an American saint, but we're not as attached to him as you are, so we'll make it optional. And this is something that the church has always done. The church is not necessarily optional feasts, but it does grant, individual dioceses, not only just countries, but individual dioceses a bit of leeway in that regard. We move on to July 1st. Before I do that, though, around May and June, we have the Feast of Pentecost. And I just want to mention just quickly, I can't really go into it, but is the Feast of Pentecost. And then we know that Pentecost octave is in red vestments. And then we go into the post-Pentecost period. We have Corpus Christi and Sacred Heart and all that. And then we get into the green time, the liturgically green time, what we call ordinary time or post-Pentecost. And that goes from, the second Sunday after Pentecost or the third Sunday after Pentecost all the way out to Advent. So it's like in the middle of the, so it's like May or June all the way to November or December. So it's like half the year. And I think a lot of people kind of get bored. I know I do sometimes, it's just like, oh, it's another Green Sunday, But what do we do during these Green Sundays? Because, it's the same liturgical season over and over. Well, first of all, one of the things we could do is focus on the saints. The saints' feast days become much more important because the Sundays are less important. But another thing we can do is because that is the time of the church. The time that we are focusing on, ordinary time or post-Pentecost, that we celebrate the birth of the church at Pentecost and the growth of the church. That's why it's green, because we're celebrating the growth of the church. And there is this interesting practice that comes from the Pacific Northwest that the missionaries there, I believe it was Blanchet, used to teach the Indians, the Salesian Indians, how to, like, he invented this thing called the Sahale stick, or the Catholic ladder. And if you look up the Catholic ladder, you'll see examples of this from the Pacific Northwest. And basically, it's just a pictorial representation of the whole history of the church, from, Adam and Eve, all through the patriarchs, the 4,000 years from Adam and Eve to Christ, and then Christ and the apostles, and then the birth of the church, and then all the long history of the church, through the ecumenical councils, and, the various heresies and everything that split off, and all the way up till today, the various countries that came into the church. So it's a real fascinating way of looking at the whole history of the church. And it's very American. It's something that was invented in America. It is something that was specifically given to the Indians and to learn. And it was said it was remarkably successful. I mean, the Indians were able to learn the history of the church very quickly from this. Even though they didn't have, facility with writing, they weren't particularly... they weren't a literate society, so they couldn't read as well until their languages finally got written down, which took, decades and centuries to do. But they were able to look at this pictorial representation and really understand the history of the church. So I just like to think of that as kind of a classic American post-Pentecost devotion, because we can look at the development of the church, we can look at how the church expanded, and we can see, okay, let's really take some time and look at the growth of the church over the last 2,000 years, and we can do it Sunday by Sunday, and we can start from the beginning in St. Peter and St. Paul, and the first century and then the second century, and go on through the Sundays after Pentecost. So, and then on and on and on until we get to the modern church, which right before Advent. And then, then we can start all over again with Advent. So that's just a little fun thing that you can do in this liturgical green time of 6 months or so. So we're going to go now to July 1st, which is the feast of St. Junipero Serra. He was born in Spain in 1713, died in California in 1784. And of course, he is the great saint of California. He helped found the Franciscan missions that run up El Camino Real all the way up the California coast. So many of our cities that we think of as California cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Santa Barbara, they're all part of that Spanish devotion to the saints, and a lot of them are just they're so they're so Catholic, and whatever else we can say about California, and unfortunately, we humans tend to mess things up, even if they're named after sacred things. But he is the great saint of California, and that's a great thing to celebrate. I don't know of any, maybe California cuisine. I don't know if there's really something good to bring to the table on July 1st, but certainly, he's a great one to remember on that day. And it's actually not the date of his death. The date of Junipero Serra's death was August 28th, and that's when most of the church throughout the world celebrates him, on August 28th. We celebrate him on July 1st, and we share that with the Franciscan order. The Franciscan order also celebrates, because he was a Franciscan, St. Junipero Serra on the July 1st. So we're kind of special in that regard. We get this little extra feast day. But again, I said before that, you don't need to necessarily confine yourself. The church sets what she does on her public ceremonies. She says, we're going to do this publicly on this day. But privately, you could do almost whenever you want. If you want to celebrate St. Junipero Serra on that day or another day on August 28th, why not? And typically the martyrs are recognized on the day of their death. It doesn't always happen, because sometimes if they died on on a big feast day. Sometimes they'll move it. People will move it because they're like, oh, well, if we can't celebrate it because this feast day will always trump the Martyrs' Day. So we'll move it a little bit, either one direction or another, or they'll pick a totally different date. Sometimes they'll pick a date out of Lent, just because we don't want to celebrate it during Lent, because then we won't be able to celebrate it with all the festivity. We want a big celebration in the summer, so they'll pick a day in the summer. So that's how to handle that. Now, of course, July 1st brings us 3 days later to July 4th, Independence Day, which, of course, is not a real liturgical day. Well, at least it wasn't traditionally a liturgical day until the 1970s, and they've kind of made it a traditional liturgical day. Just not really, maybe not officially liturgical, but it's certainly, the Missal has, for America, has a particular Mass for that day that is said. But even traditionally, before there was any kind of Mass for this day, it's been, there have been Catholic practices, and Catholics, of course, want to bring the liturgy into everything. So there have been things that the Catholics have done on July 4th. And one of the things, one of the great things, is the reading Archbishop Carroll's, or praying really, Archbishop Carroll's prayer for the church and civil authorities. Archbishop Carroll was the very first bishop of the United States. He had been a Jesuit. When the Jesuit order was suppressed, he just became a regular priest, and he was eventually chosen to be the one who would first organize the church in America. When the church in America got its own bishop, and when the 13 colonies broke away from England, the Pope set up a church here, and Archbishop Carroll was the first one made bishop, and he was given charge of the Catholics over this vast territory. And he composed this prayer for the church and civil authorities in 1800. And it's a wonderful, wonderful prayer. I know a lot of priests comment on it on our national days. It is very, very highly recommended, not only for Independence Day, because it mentions like the president and Congress and all of that, but it's very high language. It's very beautifully written prayer. Parts of it are based on some of the prayers of Good Friday, and I haven't traced all of it, but a little bit. It's almost like a mini canon of the Mass, sort of. I mean, obviously there's no sacrifice, but it's like set up the same way. With we remember this, and we remember we pray for the church, we pray for the president and the leaders of Congress and the governor of the state, and we pray for our dead, and we pray for our relatives, friends, and benefactors, and wonderful prayer. And there's also I would definitely recommend that for July 4th, and as for any other prayer of any other day of national importance. An election day, perfect for that prayer. I also want to mention that July 4th, believe it or not, is also the day that one of the North American martyrs was martyred. St. Anthony Daniel, Antoine Daniel, he died in 1648 on July 4th. So we're going to talk about the North American martyrs. We're coming up to that. Their feast day is in the fall, but they died at various points throughout the year. They didn't all die at the same time. And one of them, Anthony Daniel, was martyred on July 4th. So if you're looking for a more liturgical thing to do that day, and I think it would be neat to have him commemorated in the Mass in some way. Now, he died in Canada, I believe, not in the United States. But he is part of the North American martyrs, and, the North American martyrs were kind of, at least Isaac Jogues was here in the United States. So, we do share that with Canada. So that's a little interesting tidbit there, a fun little fact of history. We get 10 days later from July 4th is July 14th. And this is the feast of Saint Kateri Tekakwitha, as it's said in Mohawk, Tekakwitha. I don't know how people say it in English. I actually know the Mohawk pronunciation better than the English. But it's really Tekakwitha. But she was born in New York in 1656. She died near Montreal, Canada, New York State, I should say, not New York City, near Albany. In 1656, she died near Montreal, Canada in 1680 at the Mission of Conewaga. She is the first Native American to be canonized. And she is the patroness of Native Americans. So that's like a great feast day to remember Native American, our Native American heritage in this country. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful thing to remember that day. And interestingly enough, there are special Native American liturgies that were date around the time when she would have been there. So 1670, 1680, the Jesuits were saying Mass, and they were using American Indian languages in the liturgy. I've written a lot about this in some of my books some of my articles online. I've written a book about it. But yeah, so it's an interesting little liturgical fact that we have in the United States. So that's something interesting to keep in mind. And, I would particularly appreciate, and it would be a fun thing to do, to have like a Mass of St. Kateri, but using some of these old liturgical, either Mohawk or Abenaki or something, some of these other liturgical usages that were of Native American origin, because I think that'd be a fun thing to do on that day, and a way to liturgically commemorate what is part of our American and Canadian heritage. And that segues, of course, into the North American martyrs, who their feast day is, they have two feast days, actually, depending on what kind of church you go to. I go to the Old Latin Mass, and we keep this commemoration on September 26th. That's what it was since they were canonized in the 30s, I believe, right on up through the 1960s. Their feast day was September 26th. But more recently, it's been set to October 19th. So this is when most Catholics throughout the United States are celebrating the Feast of the North American Martyrs. And if you ask me which date is more accurate, which date is better, actually, the newer date is got a lot to recommend it, I have to say. Even though I'm kind of partial to the older calendar, not the newer one, the newer date has a lot to recommend it, because St. Isaac Jogues, who is the American, and he died on October 18th, and St. Jean de Lalande died on October 19th. So the two of them, who, again, since they're the American, they died in the United States of America, as opposed to the other martyrs who died in Canada. They're a little closer to our hearts, so that date makes sense to me, a lot of sense, even though I still like the old date of September 26th too. So what do you do? Which date do you pick? Well, you go to Mass, whatever it is of that day, but keep it, at your home. Keep them both. Why not? We can always use another excuse to keep a commemoration. So, like what I do is I remember them on September 26th, and if I go to Mass that day, they'll be remembered at the altar, and they won't be remembered on October 19th. I suppose I could go to a Novus Ordo, and then they would be remembered on that day, or I could just keep it, in my thoughts, and then, saying prayers that day, say the collect of their Mass again on October 19th, to remember in a special way St. Isaac Jogues. So that's, something you could do. If I just want to mention also that St. John Brebeuf and Lalemant, Gabriel Lalemant, were March 16th and 17th. Again, that's during Lent, so it's a little harder to do, but I have a particular devotion to them, so I try to remember that. And there's one interesting fact about this, and this is the only instance of this that I have actually found, but I do liturgical calendars for the Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter and their Ordo, and it's interesting that the Canadian liturgy and the American liturgy have a very, very slight point of divergence on this feast day. So, very, very slight. But if you go to a Mass on the Canadian side of the border, in Canada for the Feast of the North American Martyrs, in the Old Mass, not the New Mass. But if you go to the Old Mass in Canada, the Mass, the collect of the Mass, the priest will say Saint, Jean de Brebeuf. And this is in the Latin. I don't remember the Latin offhand, but it's basically Saint John Brebeuf, Saint Isaac Jogues, and the other martyrs. Okay, so they start that collect with Saint John de Brebeuf, then they mention Saint Isaac Jogues, and then they mention the other martyrs. Okay, but in the United States, those flip, because our saint is more Saint Isaac Jogues than Saint John de Brebeuf, who was never, as far as I know, I don't think he was in the United States of America. But we identify more with Saint Isaac Jogues. So when a priest reads that collect in the United States of America, and if you're offering the Missal of 1962 in the United States, you say Saint Isaac Jogues, Saint John de Brebeuf, and the other saints. So it's just a little slight variation in the liturgical text of that Mass, depending on whether you're in Canada or the United States. This is the only instance of this I have found, but it's kind of neat that there is that buried in the liturgy. So, a little interesting factoid there. We're going to move on to October 3rd, and that's the feast of Saint Mother Theodora Guerin. She was born in France in 1798, and she died in Indiana. And she established schools, orphanages, and pharmacies, and she is the patroness of Indianapolis. I don't know much about Mother Guerin. She has not been in the forefront of my liturgical and historical studies, but it would be interesting, of those of you from the Midwest and those of you from Indiana, certainly, you have her as a special patron that day, and it would be a great way to celebrate it. And I don't know how you would celebrate it in the Midwest. That's something for you guys to figure out. We were in Indiana earlier last year, and we one of the things we did there, and being a Pennsylvania people, we were told to stop in somewhere and get some cheese curds and eat the cheese curds, and I'm a big cheese lover, so I really enjoyed that. So I don't know if that would be appropriate for her feast day, but that's what we had in Indiana, and we enjoyed it. So that would be that's another little piece of America. So we got Hawaii and California and the Mid-Atlantic, Philadelphia and Maryland. So it's nice to have Indiana here represented in the liturgical year. Of course, later in October, we have Halloween. We don't think of that as a liturgical holiday. It is a liturgical holiday. Halloween is All Hallows Eve. It is the vigil of All Hallows, or the vigil of All Saints' Day. I can't go into too much detail here. Ms. Finnegan invited me for a little talk on it earlier, and I think that's going to be available somewhere online for people to find out about. But the liturgical feast day of Halloween, and we also have it's kind of an American holiday. Whatever Halloween is, it is a liturgical holiday, but we've kind of turned it into our own thing in a secular context in America. But not all of the secular thing is bad, and I think that the secular things can be repurposed and give greater focus and greater concentration to the liturgical holiday. And so it is the vigil of All Saints' Day, so we're thinking about All Saints' Day. And what do we do on Halloween? We like to dress up. The kids like to dress up as various things and then go out and trick-or-treating on the neighborhood. That really has been part of the Catholic view of this holiday. It's part of what we do in this country is you go to a traditional church, and these are traditional churches. They're not, they usually don't play around, but they'll have All Saints parties. So the kids will dress up as their favorite saints. And so we take that idea and we're like, maybe the demonic stuff is bad, but this idea is a good idea because we can put it to good use in the church. So kids will dress up as their favorite saints, and it becomes, the kind of the dressing up in Halloween costumes becomes a great way to liturgize the year. So I think that this is a wonderful way for us to bring a regular secular practice into the Catholic Church, and make the liturgical year come alive again. And also, Halloween is a traditional day of fast. It used to be in the United States. When the vigil was suppressed, it wasn't anymore. But so, if you want to keep that day of fast and abstinence, that's a good thing to do too. November 13th is the feast of Saint Francis Xavier Cabrini. Another saint that's dear to my heart because she was born in Italy in 1850. She died in Chicago in 1917, and she's known for her missionary work among Italian immigrants in the U.S. Like, she wanted to be a missionary to some far-off places in the East, and the Pope said, no, don't go east, go west. Go to the Americas, and there's a lot of Italian Americans there that really need help. So that's what she ended up doing. She was in a lot of cities in the U.S., New York City, New Orleans, Newark, New Jersey, Scranton, Pennsylvania, Chicago. So she has a little bit of a presence in all of these places. And of course, I can't think of no better way to celebrate her particular feast day than it's a great day to have Italian food. So if you moms out there want to come up with something for that holiday, there's basically no better thing to do than just come up with pasta and meatballs. There you go. Which is kind of Italian American to begin with. A lot of what we think of as Italian food is really like Southern Italian / American food that was kind of transformed in this country. And spaghetti meatballs was one of them. Saint Rose Philippine Duchesne, a little bit after Saint Francis Cabrini, and Saint Rose Philippine Duchesne is November 18th. She was born in France in 1769. She died in Missouri in 1852, and she is known for her ministry to Native Americans and founding schools and orphanages in Missouri, Louisiana, and Kansas. So, the great central part of our United States and Midwestern, more southerly Midwest than Indiana. But, they have a great devotion to her there. Again, I don't know too much about her because I concentrate on the East Coast saints. But, again, great to have her there as representing that portion of the country. And that's November 18th. One of the things I also want to recognize is just quickly that Thanksgiving is kind of a Catholic holiday in the sense that there's a very natural segue from giving thanks to God to the Catholic liturgy. And of course, we know Eucharist means to give thanks. So I think it's very natural for American Catholics to want to say, okay, well, how do we celebrate Thanksgiving? It's a great way to do it. Well, we should go to Mass that day. And there are Mass texts for Thanksgiving that certainly you could use those at Mass. I go to the Old Mass, so there's a votive Mass of Thanksgiving. That's kind of a different thing. But I still think that we should remember the day, and I think that this is a great holiday, and I think that it is ripe for being liturgized, and maybe in a more elaborate way than we have already done so. And I think that it would be a great thing to take the holiday of Thanksgiving and really get it back to its American roots, but also do it in a Catholic context where we're giving thanks to God for the year just passed, and that is how we kind of wrap up the year. That's kind of how we wrap up the liturgical year. Because that's going to end like right after Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving, right after Thanksgiving is the first Sunday of Advent. So that's a way to wrap up the liturgical year. I also think it makes a nice bookend. I wrote an article about this a few years ago, but it makes a nice bookend with what traditional we have. In the traditional calendar, we have the Rogation days, which are before Ascension, and they're kind of the Rogation days are days of rogare, to ask, and they're basically asking God's blessing for the harvest. So it was typically done in the old country when they would sow the seeds for the harvest. That was, they would ask God's blessing on the crops that they were planting. So I think that putting a bookend then on the end of the year for giving God thanks for the harvest is it's like a perfect bookend there. And it's even makes a nice bookend with the week, because the rogation days are Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, before Ascension Thursday. So Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we ask God for a blessing on the crops. And then Thursday, and we kind of think of Thanksgiving weekend, right? So most people have off not only on Thanksgiving, but Thanksgiving Friday, Thanksgiving Saturday's off, of course, and then Sunday is its own thing. But so we have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of the rogation days, and then Thursday, Friday, Saturday of Thanksgiving, and it closes off the week. And I think it kind of brings us full circle, and we look at it as a whole complete cycle that we've sown the crops, we've harvested the crops, and now we give thanks to God, and we can enter into the winter. The last thing I want to mention is the Immaculate Conception, because that's getting into Advent again on December 8th. It always falls during Advent, but it is the national feast of the United States. She is the national patroness of the United States. So it's a big deal. It's a holy day of obligation. We have to go to Mass that day. But of course we want to go to Mass because this is our patron saint. It's a typical, it's celebrated throughout the world, the octave of the Immaculate Conception. How can we as Americans, is there anything special that we can bring to the table? I actually think that there is. There's a great sermon that I like to meditate on and to read is St. John Neumann's pastoral letter on the dogma from 1854. So he writes a great, he was Bishop of Philadelphia, remember? We talked about him on January 5th. But he wrote a great pastoral letter to his diocese in 1854 about the promulgation of the dogma, and it's just a great thing to read. I think, as an American bishop, and just kind of explaining it, and just some wonderful, wonderful prose there. And that's one of the things that I kind of like to do, to put a little bit of an American spin on the feast. And then the day, again, had a vigil on December 7th. So that's a great day to do some penance. So if you want to do some extra penance that day, perfect. So the traditional way of observing that would have been fast and abstinence, so no meat, and you would only eat one meal a day with one little collation, one little snack, sometime another time of the day. But and that was typical. That's what Americans did up until fairly recently. I think in the maybe 1917 or 1955. I'm not sure when that changed, but until recently, it's certainly by the time when the Baltimore Catechism was being promulgated, that was what was traditional in the USA, that Americans would have a vigil day before that feast. And then, of course, that feast had an octave too. So you had the octave of the Immaculate Conception. You would celebrate it for 8 days, which is kind of wonderful in our country, because now we have, for example, the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which happens on the 12th of December, and a lot of Americans, especially of Hispanic heritage, are very attached to. That falls right in that octave of the Immaculate Conception. So it's kind of a great way to just meditate on Our Lady and her Immaculate Conception and how she has figured into the liturgical year. And so that's it. That wraps up our liturgical year and our American liturgical year. And again, I just want to stress that this is the calendar is one of the greatest ways that the Church has given us to live out our patriotism and to live out our love for our country, not in a jingoistic way, but just as part of the fourth commandment, as like, this is the country that is my father, this is my country that is my mother. It is the country that gave rise to me, that gave birth to me, that has sheltered me, that has raised me, and I owe it that kind of a respect, and I love it for that reason, because it is so close to me, and this is where I'm from. And this devotion to the American saints helps do that, and it helps channel that patriotism in a very healthy, very holy direction by giving us models of behavior as Americans. Okay, as Americans, like what does it mean to be a good American? I think that we not only we can not only look at our founding fathers and what they did and what great Americans have done throughout the ages, but we all know that they have too. They have been racked with sin, and just as we are, and just as the saints are too. But the saints have lived the Christian life. They have lived the life of Christ in a way that puts them in a category above even the founding fathers, and above you and me, and above everyone else. And so that gives us an even higher model than we experience with other Americans. So it's to them that we kind of look at, and they're the ones that we should emulate throughout the year. And of course, their feast days are worth integrating into our year all the more. Like, there is no reason why we shouldn't celebrate these festivities with as great love and with greatest festivity as they do in Europe for their own patron saints and everything. No one is going to do that for us. We can't wait for the Italians to do this. We can't wait for the English to do this. We can't wait for the Nigerians or the Uruguayans. Like, this has to be us. There's nobody going to celebrate, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton and Mother Guerin and St. Mary Ann Cope. Nobody's going to celebrate them more than us. Okay, we have to do this because they are our people. They are our nation. They are our fellow citizens. Okay, and we have the greatest devotion to them throughout the world. So it's something that we should be looking at in the American church. And if we do that, I think we will understand in a better way, in a stronger way, what it is to be American, what it is to be filled with the light of Christ in this land that we live in, and really what it is to be an American in heaven, because they've already done it. If we want to ask what's it like to be an American in heaven, how do you bring your Americanness into heaven? Ask them. They already did it. They already did it many years ago, and we'll have other saints and ones that I didn't mention here, blesseds and venerables who still remain to be canonized or have canonized, and I just left them out here, but they've already done it. So we just have to follow in their footsteps. And I thank again Ms. Finnegan for allowing me to give this talk, and I wish you all a very liturgical and a very healthy and a happy and especially a holy semi-quincentennial as we celebrate the birthday of the United States. God bless you all, and God bless the United States of America.